Hey everyone, and welcome back to another Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're here today, because we're going to dig into a truly fascinating mystery that's been hiding right in plain sight. We are going to explore how analysts, policymakers, and, let's be real, most of us have been completely misreading the data when the general public expresses concern about artificial intelligence. You know, we often think we know exactly what people mean when they answer a survey on existential risk, but as you'll see, the true meaning is actually buried deep in the psychology of governance.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Picture a standard public poll asking a pretty heavy question. Is AI dangerous to human civilization? When someone selects somewhat agree, what does that actually mean? Well, the common assumption across the tech and policy worlds is that this response equals hesitation. It's treated as this weak conviction, kind of like the person is saying, maybe it's dangerous, maybe it's not, I haven't really made up my mind. But guess what? Behavioral science tells a completely different story.
To see what I mean, take a look at this number, 0.0746. This is a hard science Pearson correlation pulled from a massive global poll. We're talking 908 people across 77 countries. It statistically links that somewhat agree response directly to what spiral dynamics theory calls the blue vMEME stage. Basically, that's a psychological worldview built entirely around order, structure, and rules. And because this meets the strict statistical reliability criteria, we know for sure this isn't just random noise. We are looking at a highly specific, very real psychological pattern.
To put this into perspective, think about this quote from Elon Musk. He noted that when things are a danger to the public, you don't want companies cutting corners, which is exactly why we have agencies like the FDA or the FAA. Now, looking at this neutrally, purely as a behavioral data point, it perfectly captures the essence of that blue worldview. It's this deep, overarching desire for procedural safety and strict oversight long before any disaster actually happens. So here is our roadmap for today's Explainer. We'll start by unpacking the myth of hesitation, then move into decoding calibrated concern. After that, we'll explore something called the prediction gap, look at escalation and system collapse, and finally, learn how to engineer procedural trust. This structure should help lighten the cognitive load before we get into the really cool mathematical frameworks ahead.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the myth of hesitation. This is exactly where so many historical AI risk frameworks literally just fall flat. They treat this calibrated concern as mere hesitation, without ever stopping to check if the underlying psychological system recognizes it as something else entirely. When analysts see somewhat agree, they immediately assume a lack of shared understanding about the threat. But what if it's actually a demand for a highly structured, organized response?
Which brings us nicely to Section 2, decoding calibrated concern.
Now, what is really fascinating about the data here is how it proves a mathematical pattern. Just notice the correlation between the blue view world and a preference for state control and institutional oversight. The data firmly links this blue vMEME stage to a deep-seated desire for order. It's not just some passing feeling. It is a measurable psychological state vector. That means it's a fixed, totally predictable direction in human behavior.
So what does this all mean? Well, an individual operating from a blue worldview isn't dismissing the existential danger of AI at all. Instead, they are signaling their calibrated concern. They're telling us that maintaining trust in society requires real procedural safeguards. They strongly prefer structured, rule-based responses over extreme, absolute ideological positions. It's not hesitation, folks. It is a direct call for governance.
Let's move on to Section 3, the prediction gap. To really understand this gap, imagine a single existential threat, like AI is dangerous to human civilization, passing through a prism. It gets refracted into entirely different psychological languages. The blue stage, as we've seen, demands regulatory frameworks and procedural controls. But the orange stage, which is driven by achievement, wants to maintain rapid innovation velocity while adding risk mitigation strategies. And then you have the green stage, focusing on community, which demands ethical consensus and inclusive deliberation. It's the exact same shared threat, but it produces three totally divergent logical responses.
This naturally leads us to Section 4, escalation and system collapse.
So what happens when policymakers ignore these different languages? Well, when risk assessment stops being a calibrated process and is forced into a strict "you're either with us or against us" ideological certainty, the system reacts terribly. The blue worldview completely loses its nuance anchor. Suddenly, policy debates deeply polarize along value system lines. And here's the truly scary part. Institutional trust just begins to erode and fracture, even while the outward regulatory frameworks miraculously stay intact.
If we trace this downward cascade, it's pretty clear. It kicks off with ideological framing, which instantly triggers procedural distrust. That distrust leads to governance fragmentation, and finally, a silent coordination loss. This system collapse isn't some dramatic, fiery explosion. Actually, scratch that. It's much worse. It is a quiet, detrimental drift. You just slowly lose the ability to coordinate society because you've removed procedural trust as the core signal.
Finally, let's wrap things up with Section 5, Engineering Procedural Trust.
So how do we fix this? The absolute crucial point is that we must use these measurable correlations to translate policy across those varying psychological states. It's basically the algebra of conscience. If you know a group is blue dominant, you absolutely must deliver procedural clarity. If they're orange dominant, you have to frame it as calibrated risk mitigation. And if they're green, you prioritize inclusive stakeholder engagement. Policy simply fails when it ignores these differences. We have to map the hidden wiring of society to maintain stability.
And this brilliantly illustrates how we can actually solve this in practice. What we're looking at is an interface built through AI vibe coding, which is this amazing trend where users instruct LLMs in plain natural language to build complex apps without traditional code. It maps these vMEME trajectories and psychological sensors. Notice that 0.690 stability score? By understanding these correlations, the system can dynamically predict which policy paths will preserve procedural trust before a single rule is even implemented. It surfaces those critical cross-stage patterns that our human bias almost always misses.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. When we look at the global data, we see that humans are incredibly complex, yet surprisingly mathematically predictable in their values. So ask yourself, what truly breaks when risk assessment stops being a calibrated governance signal and just devolves into an ideological position? And moving forward, how are you going to design policy frameworks that actively preserve procedural trust rather than just forcing ideological conviction? Thank you so much for learning with me today, and keep exploring these incredible patterns.